Hello, welcome back. Let's pick up with our Thelonious Monk stories. Thelonious Monk, his life in music. But first, seashells. Now that it's cold around here, I really miss the beach. So, let's see where we left off. This chapter is called The Purpose of Life. In 1969, Larry Gales and Ben Riley left the quartet, and Monk had trouble finding long-term replacements. Although he was able to maintain a first-rate band with temporary players, he was increasingly worn down by personnel problems. As a result, he and Charlie Rouse, the nucleus of the quartet, sometimes performed as a duo. Certainly, the music scene had changed drastically in the preceding 10 years. Free jazz was the rage. It functioned as a musical pendant to the contemporary protest movement, especially in Europe. Yet Monk still regularly appeared, as he had for years, at the Village Vanguard or Village Gate. He was also a frequent guest at Club Baron in Harlem. In the fall of 1970, he visited Europe with the quartet and made a memorable appearance at the Berlin Jazz Festival. The organizer, Joachim Ernst Berendt, had intended this as a tribute to Duke Ellington on his 70th birthday. Monk was prepared in his solo outing to play pieces by Ellington exclusively. He worked the piano as if he were in a trance. He grunted, stamped his feet, and made his left hand jump powerfully all over. The energy grew from piece to piece. The audience in this capital of the protest movement, mainly receptive to free jazz, were ecstatic. When it came time for an encore, Monk played one of his own pieces. He did so with a concentrated intensity, as if the performance up to that point had been only a prelude. Now he was going to show them what he was really about. Inspired by the applause, he then played extremely cooperatively with the stride pianist Joe Turner, accompanied by bass and drums. TV cameras were on hand and showed everything in close-up. After his appearance, Monk sat down quietly next to Nellie in the vestibule behind the stage, looking old and tired. After Berlin, he toured the rest of Europe with the quartet. In December, he played Paris. There, Monk was so upset by the inept playing of his teenage drummer Austin Wright that after the break he brought Philly Joe Jones, who was resting backstage, up on the podium. All of this was captured on television. At the beginning of 1970, Charlie Rouse, sick of the continual changes in the rhythm section, left the quartet during an engagement at the Village Vanguard. He later had kind words for Monk, both as a leader and as a friend. He called him a master who knew how to bring the best out of his fellow musicians. Monk demanded almost the impossible from them, but inspired them with the confidence that they could produce it. With Rouse's departure, Monk no longer tended to the substitutions himself. Wilbur Ware, the bassist in the band, brought the baritone saxophonist Pat Patrick into the quartet. Monk appeared to have lost his native optimism. At home, it is true, one could still find him in good humor. Patrick reports that in playful moods he would sometimes perform in the style of Fats Waller or Art Tatum. In that year, however, Monk did not tour Europe, although he did make a guest appearance in Japan again with different personnel. Back from Japan, he next went to California with the tenor saxophonist Paul Jeffrey, who would remain Monk's regular horn player until the end. He played there 6 full months with continually changing basses and drummers. He was waiting until the situation in New York was settled. The tenants above his apartment wanted him evicted from his old home for making too much noise. In April 1971, Monk returned to New York. He tried to put together a quartet with Paul Jeffrey and engaged his son Thelonious Jr. as a drummer. They appeared at a jazz festival in Mexico where he also gave his final interview. No trace of his dynamic optimism remains. To the interviewer, Pearl Gonzalez's last question, "What is the purpose of life?" Monk replies, "To die." To the interviewer's objection that between life and death there was surely much to do, Monk countered, "You asked me a question, that's the answer." This answer seems like a distant, tired echo of a conversation Monk had with the American drummer and one-time Monk sideman Art Taylor in Paris on October 15th the same year. Asked what his attitude to the Black Power movement was, Monk replied, "I did all that fighting with O-Phase when I was a kid. We had to fight to make it so we could walk the streets. There's no reason why I should go through the Black Power shit now. I guess everybody in New York had to do that, right? Because every block is a different town. It was mean all over New York, all the boroughs. Then, besides fighting the O-Phase, you had to fight each other. You go in the next block and you're in another country. Don't look at a chick living in the next block and expect to be taking her home and all that. You might not make it. All people have got to do is make friends with each other." Taylor, do the kids seem more aware now than they did years ago? Monk, I don't know. I was aware of all this when I was a little baby, 5 or 6 or 7 years old. I was aware of how the cops used to act. It looked like the order of the day was for the cops to go out and call all the kids black bastards. Anything you did, if you ran or something, they called you black bastards. Taylor, that was their favorite lick. Monk, yeah, I remember that. It was the first thing that came out of their mouth. Taylor, I consider myself lucky to have survived. Monk, sure you're lucky to have survived. You're lucky to survive every second. You're facing death at all times. You don't know where it's going to come from. Monk was tired of the duties of being a band leader. It is therefore not surprising that he accepted the offer of George Wine to go on a world tour with an all-star group of bebop greats. After the financial success of 1971, these giants of jazz went on tour again in 1972, including Europe. Dizzy Gillespie played trumpet, Kai Winding trombone, Sonny Stitt saxophone, Al McKibben bass, and Art Blakey drums. Because all 6 musicians had once been band leaders, and no one wanted or was able to dictate to the rest, they confined themselves to a repertoire of bebop standards. These are performed rather indifferently, in a blowing session manner. The financial motive took precedence over artistic considerations. During the band's first European engagement in 1971, the British label Black Lion seized the initiative and asked Monk to make solo recordings and trio recordings with Al McKibben and Art Blakey. Monk agreed, and in a relaxed atmosphere to which Nellie Monk's presence in the studio certainly contributed. 3 LPs were recorded. Blakey and McKibben enjoyed being sidemen again for their former boss, the more so as they were of the opinion that Monk's music was not being performed properly by the other giants of jazz. Thus, the last recordings that Monk was to make as a band leader were in London. They actually number among his best. At the beginning of 1973, Monk was again at the Village Vanguard. Then in February at Top of the Gate, the piano restaurant above the village gate. He had to interrupt this engagement owing to a lingering illness, and he made clear that he did not want to appear in clubs any longer. In general, he was in decline. He was disposed to depression and suffered from memory lapses. 2 years earlier, he had been admitted to a New York hospital because of a slight stroke and lung inflammation. The Baroness says this about his sickness. This was the first year he lived here in her newly acquired house in Weehawken, New Jersey. We were driving home from New York, and he suddenly turned to me and said, "I am very seriously ill." This is the only thing Thelonious has ever been heard to say about being ill at all. He never said it again. Concerning Monk's unwillingness to appear publicly, Charlie Rouse says simply, "Something really clicked in him. He didn't want to play anymore." In April 1974, Monk surfaced unexpectedly at a concert of the New York Jazz Repertory Company in Carnegie Hall dedicated to his compositions. His participation had been planned, but he had not shown up at rehearsals. Barry Harris was preparing to seat himself at the piano when Monk suddenly appeared on stage. Barry Harris had come to New York, become a house seminarian, and was now Monk's closest friend after Nika de Koningswater. The success of the concert may have inducted Monk to participate in Newport in New York. And so, on July 3, 1975, a quartet consisting of him, Paul Jeffrey, Larry Gales, and Thelonious Jr. played at Lincoln Center as part of this event. After a layoff of nearly a year, on March 26, 1976, he played with the same quartet, plus guest trumpeter Lonnie Hillier at Carnegie Hall. At Carnegie Hall again on June 30th of the same year, and with the same quartet, he gave the last concert of his life. On July 4th, he popped up at Bradley's, the New York piano bar where Barry Harris was performing. He sat in on piano for a pair of numbers. He then disappeared into the night and out of the jazz world altogether. During his last years, Monk withdrew to Nika de Koningswater's estate in New Jersey. He spent most of his time lying in bed watching television. Laurent de Wilde reports that during this period, he had bladder and prostate operations. The quality of his life suffered as a result from the outside world. He would admit only a few close friends and associates like Barry Harris. Harris says he was psychologically ill. No one could say for certain what was wrong with him. He simply resigned himself and did nothing. In his last years, he generally did not play. As a living corpse, whose spirit was tied to the atrophied shackles of his body, he simply existed. On February 5th, 1982, Thelonious Monk suffered a stroke, to which he succumbed on the 17th of February, 1982, without again regaining consciousness. He died at Nika de Koningswater's estate in the arms of his wife Nellie. I was just looking at this picture. He looks very different in this picture. Let's see if you can see. Monk arrived on the New York jazz scene around 1940, his personal style was already fully developed. Throughout his life, he was seriously interested in nothing besides his music, which from an early point on shows no stylistic break or alteration. His interpretations are always marked by a fresh, deeply probing exploration of the material. The material, for the most part, consists of compositions that Monk wrote during the second half of the 40s and first half of the 50s. On every recording to which Monk is known to have contributed, he plays in his unmistakable style. In his biography, Dizzy Gillespie states that he never heard Monk play differently. Oscar Pettiford confirms this, as does Kenny Clarke, whose acquaintance with Monk dates back to their school days. Clarke, to be sure, says that when Monk played gospel music in those days, there was nothing distinctive about his playing, and Mary Lou Williams heard Monk when he was just out of school at a jam session in Kansas City, where he made a stop in the late 30s accompanying a travel evangelist. She ascribes to him at that time a fast, fluent style, one that was nevertheless different from swing. But it is safe to say that from the moment he emerged as a jazz pianist, he always played only as Monk. The recordings that Jerry Newman made in 1941 at Minton's Playhouse with Charlie Christian, Joe Guy, and Kenny Clarke and Monk supposedly appear to contradict this. But Henry Renaud, who did a good deal of work with Monk, identified Kenny Kersey as the pianist on these recordings. Jacques Reda, Jazz Magazine, Paris, June 1979, compared these with the Jerry Newman recordings made with Don Byas the same year, to which Monk certainly did contribute. And in his inimitable style, he proved conclusively that Monk could not have been on hand for the much-discussed recording with Charlie Christian that reportedly shows his playing originally under the influence of Teddy Wilson. This agrees with the assertion of Laurent de Waal that Monk and Christian never recorded together. Monk himself says that from the beginning he always expressed himself in the same idiom, and that no one else's ideas influenced him. Dizzy Gillespie says expressly and emphatically that he never heard Monk play like Teddy Wilson, or anyone else for that matter. He also identifies Ken Kersey as the pianist on the recordings with Charlie Christian. Whoever can't recognize Monk had better turn in his union card. That is what Cal Tjader said during a blindfold test. In fact, hardly any other pianist has as distinctive a sound, and sound was the controlling word in Monk's discussions with fellow musicians. Monk was concerned above all with sounds with which he might portray his beloved New York and the people that surrounded him there. But as soon as the critic tries to describe what this sound is, he or she wanders off into realms of profound mystification. One reads of strangely tuned pianos such as those found on the early Prestige recordings. But during this period, Monk, from a commercial standpoint, was very much a gamble, and to his chagrin, the recording company skimped on piano tuners, as also later on the 5-spot recordings made with Mal Waldron, with Eric Dolphy, and Booker Little. This is nevertheless a peculiarly disharmonious harmony to his music. First of all, there is the unconventional tone production, which is to say, his harshly percussive sound. Attention to touch as a factor in tone production in the Western classical sense is rare in jazz circles. It is nonetheless standard practice to hold the hands with the fingers bent and spread, and this applies not only to the fast, brilliant playing of an Art Tatum, but also to the rapid blowing lines of a Bud Powell. But Thelonious Monk, this huge giant of a man with small feminine hands, used a different technique entirely. Whip-like, his hands would dart to the keys and hammer them as a drummer strikes the skins with his sticks. This technique, essentially percussive in character, stands in contrast to a technique designed for speed and fluency. But to interpret this as a sign of pianistic ineptitude is to fail to appreciate Monk's peculiar kind of virtuosity. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. Catch me in the next video. May you find lasting happiness.